back to Chicago Crossing Model Railroad. Eric here with you for another weekend on the layout. And today is mostly about evolving the scene that you see here. This is a combination between the bridge tender house scene as well as the diorama that sits in front of the grain mill. You know, this area houses a truck from the railroad, or at least the truck occasionally parks there, and we talked about Jersey barriers as a scenic element for this as well. But, you know, you kind of look at it right now, and it's a bit of a blank space. In a previous pass, especially between these two inner tracks, I had laid down maybe a little bit of static grass, but it just sort of doesn't have a lot of substance to it. So for the moment, what I'm doing is putting down some matte media and then putting down some brush behind these Jersey barriers to make things overgrown. This is kind of the first stage. Second stage we'll get to then is going to be actually making that truck parking spot really kind of stand out as a key scenic element instead of just kind of some backyard dirt and cinders as it looks now. So join in, we'll chat a little bit about this after I get done. So now I've got all the scenery there, and what I've envisioned for this truck parking spot is basically kind of an area where there's just a couple of ruts where the tires are. So we're gonna lay down static grass for that. So time to drive the truck on there and just make sure the fit is okay. Everything Looks pretty good here. And so next up, what I'm going to do is just kind of fill in some of these gaps where the ties are and add a little bit more vegetation in between. Mostly just going to use like a burnt grass, fine turf here, and even just plug in a little bit of static grass. You know, this is like 4 to 7 millimeter stuff. I think this is 7. And fits in pretty nice. And then behind that is just some kind of light green turf. You know, to some extent, the color of the turf that you use, in this case, it really doesn't matter all that much because this is all going to get airbrushed. So, you know, you think of this as kind of just a base color. And you really, you know, if you use an airbrush or another method to just kind of color your scenery, as you'll see, you really don't need to buy a ton of different turf, so you're actually looking a little bit more for the texture than you are for the color. So for the moment, just kind of putting this stuff down. I mean, I like the burnt grass color. It's actually pretty satisfying, and you don't need to edit it that much with an airbrush, so I think that's okay. I'll just add a little bit more here. I'm also going to glue down that Jersey barrier in order to make sure that it stays put. So you can almost imagine it was forked in on top of the grass in this case. So it'll shove it down, and that's okay. The main thing is you just want these concrete objects to look heavy, and also don't want the train to run into them, even though the train is never really supposed to hit the buffers at the very end there, but I'll probably put a few more Jersey barriers along that route, so that's all right. And so, yeah, basically just filling in more terrain here. Gonna put a big clump of stuff right there. That's looking good. I'll fill it in a little more. Now, the other thing to just notice here, because you probably see that there's a huge amount of contrast between the color of this static grass and everything surrounding, and you can also see that what I'm gluing in place now is also really kind of not the same color as its surroundings. And that's okay. As I mentioned before, in a previous video several of these ago, I always come back with an airbrush. All this area before was kind of a mix of backyard dirt and cinders, the kind of cinders you get from like Woodland Scenics, for instance. And that looks great. But, you know, the dimensionality here, it's just a lot of fun to see. It also helps to make this, you know, Jersey barrier kind of fit in so it looks like it's heavy and sitting into something there. I may go ahead and add additional Jersey barriers here. So anyway, what we're going to keep doing here is basically adding some additional greenery around. Particularly here, you notice there's this kind of box. That's actually the back of, or the bottom of, the loading dock, and that's going to be a super weedy area. You can kind of mix in a lot of different plant life into this area, and it'll just look good. You know, I think you always want to have a mixture of different plants and things like that, simply because it breaks up patterns and it represents how things are actually in real life. You know, especially in these overgrown industrial areas, you have 10 or 12 or more different species of plants that are likely to be growing in that area. And so you can model that. So in this case, you know, forceps are your best friend. You just sort of drop it in. This is all matte media that I'm using here. And, you know, different sizes, different locations, it's all good. I'll probably have another Jersey barrier, or a few of them over here in order to just sort of direct that truck like so. In which case, a little matte media on top of the static grass, and then we place this thing in. And it's amazing how nicely it just sort of fits in. It's like a bigger layer of static grass essentially, and so it just looks really good. So this is kind of how you spend a good weekend day where you don't necessarily feel like committing deeply into other different areas like building a new building or rebuilding something. I've got, a list of probably 40 different things I need to do for this layout. But in the hobby world, the term need is kind of always, well, what do I feel like? And so today, I feel like this. All right, now the usual ritual, I'm going to do a little bit of airbrush blending. So I've got flat earth in here. This is the Tamiya color. I'm basically just working to find a good average in color. Especially up front here, I actually do want to try to keep a little bit more of these bright green bits. But as you can see, you can kind of tone down some other things. And I'll actually come back with some brighter green to pull out a few of these elements as well. But especially over here, you can kind of see this is an area that particularly, and even in this cindery area, that's what flat earth is really good at. Just trying to create a little more averaging of color. And get in right close. I'm shooting at about 15 psi, very dilute paint. Again, Tamiya, you can dilute, and dilute some more. And it's totally fine. And then likewise, I'm also getting into these ruts. This looks like a lot of contrast, and I'm actually I don't want that much contrast with those cinders. And so you come in, and you can even create this kind of a muddy look in some of that area. And that looks really nice, and it helps to just kind of, recalibrate it a little bit towards being, dirt, maybe a little bit more than the cinders. And I'm going to come back with a little bit of buff and go over that stuff too. All right, got a little bit of buff here now. So what you're starting to notice now is that you're getting a much lighter tone in these ruts, and that's exactly what I'm after. I didn't want it to be the dark cinders, and I might even just come over here and hit a couple of these ties and stuff like that in the siding. And you might as well, if you're going to do this sort of painting, you can create all sorts of textures and colors and things like that. It's, this is all IPA based, so it's easy enough to just sort of come back and clean up the rails or something like that if need be. But really, it just creates that little bit of variation that looks particularly pleasing to the eye. Next up, a little bit of NATO black. I actually just want to come back and hit certain ties. Again, the more you can vary these scenes, the better off. And you do kind of end up committing a little bit to now do this to the rest of your layout. That's fine. Chicago Crossing isn't going anywhere. So I'm literally in no rush with these models. So you can do pretty much whatever you want. Again, a couple darker ties. This is essentially this NATO black with a little bit of the buff still in there. I mean, the funny thing about all of these colors is, you know, it's almost like controlled chaos. You know, plants, they're biological things, and they come in all sorts of colors and all sorts of shades. And so you embrace randomness a little bit on your layout, and you embrace the randomness of the plant life that you have, and you remember that paint and pigment is something that mixes with whatever else you have down. And so you can get all sorts of really interesting combinations just based off of that. And if you apply it in really, really, really light coats like this, then you don't have a chance of making an error, because you just let go on the trigger. If it looks just right to you, leave it there, and then you're done. So kind of the same. You can use it on the concrete, you can use it wherever in order to create all sorts of filters and you know, areas where the concrete is beginning to spall and come apart or is stained, any of that. And it just adds a lot of depth to the layout. You know, this is where kind of taking multiple passes at your layout is a really good thing. All right, so now we're going to come in with some regular old green. This is just Tamiya flat green. I'm just going to, you know, create little patches of healthier grass. And it also is just kind of a good blending color as well. And I've still got a little bit of that NATO black in there too, which is totally fine. So you get little bits of healthy grass in there, little bits of less healthy. And you can even use it to sort of imply moss and stuff like that within the track work, or, you know, wherever you like. That's the other cool thing about it, is you've already got texture. And so if you've already got texture, then really color is the only other element. And some of this texture that you put down, you know, like these bits of rocks and dirt, if you tint that green a little bit, then it really does give you the impression that you've got some, you know, very, very low growing, dusty kind of vegetation and things like that. There we go. So you can already see, you know, relative to the way that we began on this diorama, this is already so much more just kind of interesting to look at, right? Because you've created now over in here a lot of depth of color that, you know, fits nicely with the texture. You've picked out in much better ways kind of how that little roadway works, because you've highlighted instead of low lighted. And so you have, you know, some really nice kind of visuals there. So yeah, I really like the way this stuff is beginning to shake out now. Well, that looks pretty good to me. I don't see a whole lot else to add for the moment. So let's put the building back. I'm not going to actually plug it back in. I would rather just kind of see how the scene composes at this stage. So we'll take a look now and see what we've got. Well, I've got to say, that actually looks pretty good. Can kind of zoom in here, and you can see the way that the truck kind of sits in that set of grooves actually. It looks really nice. So obviously the truck itself needs a bit of dirt at this point. It looks super clean for mostly being parked in the mud. But I think as a kind of general look to a scene, that looks really nice. And as you can see that the changes in the coloration of the ties add a little something else. And just all of the coloration in the grass texture really adds a lot of, new interest and, some nice visual elements. So that is kind of another good pass at this scene. Pretty happy with how that turned out. So we'll leave it at that for this week. Thanks again for watching.